March 22nd, 1980. Bay Shore, Long Island. A Friday night that started like every other Friday night and ended in a way that would consume the next 42 years of one family's life. Eve Wilkowitz was 20 years old. She had just finished dinner with a friend in Manhattan. She boarded the last Long Island Railroad train out of Penn Station, a ride she had made hundreds of times before, heading home to the small apartment where her boyfriend was waiting, where her coat hung by the door, where her ordinary Saturday morning was supposed to begin in a few hours. She never walked through that door. 3 days later, her body was found on a front lawn on Center Avenue in Bay Shore, barefoot, bound at the wrist with rope, strangled, for houses from where her killer had been sleeping that entire week. Suffolk County Police launched one of the largest homicide investigations in the department's history. They knocked on hundreds of doors. They interviewed everyone. They knocked on the killer's own mother's door, and she told them she hadn't noticed anything unusual. And for 42 years, that was where it stayed. No name, no suspect, not a single match in any DNA database in the country. Then, in March of 2022, investigators drove to a small cemetery in Bay Shore, obtained a court order, and opened a coffin that had been sealed for 31 years. They pulled DNA from the bones of a man who had died in 1991 and taken every answer with him into the ground. The results came back on March 23, 2022, almost exactly 42 years to the day Eve disappeared. The DNA matched. This is a story of how Suffolk County solved its oldest cold case by reaching into a grave. And before we get to how they did it, we need to talk about who Eve Wilkowitz actually was, because she deserves to be remembered for the life she was building, not only for the night it was taken from her. Before we go any further, let us know where you are watching from. Drop your city in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe. We cover cold cases every week on this channel, the ones that most people stopped talking about a long time ago. In the spring of 1980, America was still shaking off the weight of the 1970s. The Iran hostage crisis was 8 months old and grinding through every evening news broadcast. Ronald Reagan was running for president on a promise to make the country feel strong again. Mount St. Helens was 2 months away from erupting. The country felt unsettled in the way it does when one era is ending, and no one is certain what comes next. Long Island existed slightly outside all of that noise. The South Shore communities, Bay Shore, Islip, Oakdale, Babylon, were working-class towns built around the Long Island Railroad. Fathers and mothers who commuted into the city every morning and came back every evening to neighborhoods where people knew each other's names, where kids rode bikes until dark, where a woman walking home from the train station at 1:30 in the morning was not supposed to be in any danger at all. Bay Shore was that kind of place. Modest, familiar, quiet after midnight. The kind of community where the worst thing that happened was usually a car break-in or a noise complaint. That sense of safety was not naive. It was earned over decades of ordinary life. It made what happened to Eve Wilkowitz feel not just criminal, but like a violation of something people had come to take for granted. Eve had grown up in Oakdale, a small hamlet in the town of Islip, just a few miles from Bay Shore. She grew up with her younger sister Irene and their parents, Alfred and Dorothy Wilkowitz. The family was close in the way families become close when hardship arrives early. Their mother, Dorothy, was diagnosed with breast cancer when the girls were still young. She fought it for years. She lost. Dorothy died in 1976. Irene was 13. Eve was 16 or 17. Alfred was left raising 2 daughters alone, and Eve, as the older sister, stepped into a space that went far beyond what any teenager should have to fill. She became the second anchor in a household that had just lost its center. Irene would describe her simply, years later. Mostly, she said, Eve liked being a big sister. That sentence carries everything. Not a list of accomplishments. Not a resume. The thing Eve loved most was the role she played in her own family. She was outgoing and curious, the kind of person who collected friends and kept them. She loved horses above almost everything else, spending time at the riding stable scattered across Suffolk County. And anyone who has spent time around horses understands what she was getting from them. A different pace, a quieter world, freedom from everything that was loud and complicated. She also loved music, reading, writing, drawing. She was always engaged, always creating something, always asking what was next. By 1980, she had landed what Irene called her dream job, a secretary position at Macmillan Publishing Company in Midtown Manhattan, one of the most prestigious publishing houses in the country. Entry-level work, answering phones, managing correspondence. But she was 20 years old and surrounded by writers and editors and books in one of the great literary cities in the world. For someone who loved words the way Eve did, it was exactly where she wanted to be. The commute was brutal. More than an hour each way, every day. From Bayshore into Penn Station on the Long Island Railroad, packed in with tens of thousands of other commuters. Morning train in, evening train home. 3 hours of her day gone before she had done a single useful thing. But she was making it work because she had bigger plans. She wanted to move into the city eventually, cut the commute, build something closer to the center of it all. She talked about studying social work, about helping people, about doing something that mattered. She was living in Bayshore with her boyfriend, a 21-year-old construction worker. She had recently become friends with a young writer at Macmillan named Jack Dempsey. Life was in motion. She was not passing through her 20s. She was building them deliberately with purpose, with the kind of energy that comes from knowing exactly what direction you want to move in, even if the full picture isn't clear yet. That is who Eve Wilkowitz was in March of 1980. A daughter, a sister, a friend, a woman with a plan, and the willingness to grind for it every single day on a packed commuter train. She deserves to be remembered that way. On the evening of Friday, March 21st, 1980, Eve finished her workday at Macmillan Publishing in Manhattan and had dinner with a friend in the city. A normal Friday. The kind of evening she had probably had dozens of times before. After dinner, Jack Dempsey drove her to Penn Station. He dropped her off at the entrance. That was the last time anyone who was not her killer would see her alive. Penn Station in 1980 was not the renovated transit hub it is today. It was underground, dim, a cavernous space built for volume rather than comfort. Late on a Friday night, the crowds thinned to a particular kind of traveler. People heading home late, tired, done with the city until Monday. The last trains carried fewer people, longer silences, wider gaps between passengers. Eve boarded the 12:39 a.m. Long Island Railroad train, heading east toward Bayshore, the last train of the night in that direction. Missing it would have meant waiting until morning or finding another way home. She didn't miss it. The train rattled through Jamaica, through the Nassau County stations, and out into the longer, darker stretches of Suffolk County, where the station platforms got smaller and the streetlights got further apart. When it pulled into Bayshore sometime after 1:30 in the morning, Eve stepped off the platform and started walking. Her apartment on Fifth Avenue was roughly 10 minutes on foot from the station. She had made this walk many times before, down quiet residential streets, past parked cars and darkened single-family homes, through a neighborhood that was asleep before she arrived. There is something she had told people in the weeks before that night, something that matters and should have changed what happened, but didn't. Eve had mentioned to people close to her that a man had followed her on her late-night walk home from the Bayshore station. She didn't have a name. She didn't file a police report, but she noticed, and she was frightened, and she told the people in her life about it, and she kept making the walk anyway because it was the only way home she had. Her boyfriend was expecting her around 2 o'clock in the morning. He fell asleep waiting. When he woke at 7 a.m., the apartment was exactly as he had left it. Her coat was not hanging by the door. Her side of the bed was untouched. No note, no message, no sign she had ever come home at all. He called police and filed a missing person report that same morning. 3 days of silence followed. No calls from Eve, no sightings, no witnesses from the train or the platform or the streets between. Nothing from hospitals. Nothing from her workplace. Nothing from anyone who had seen anything on that 10-minute stretch between the railroad station and her front door. For 72 hours, Eve Wilkowitz had simply vanished. On the morning of Tuesday, March 25, 1980, a neighbor walking on Center Avenue noticed a figure on the front lawn of the house at 26 Center Avenue. A young woman, barefoot, motionless. It was Eve. Her coat was gone. Her blouse was missing. Her shoes were gone. The pocketbook she had carried out of Manhattan that Friday night was nowhere at the scene. Her wrists carried deep ligature marks, the kind left by rope tied tightly over an extended period. There were signs she had been assaulted while in captivity. The Suffolk County medical examiner performed the autopsy. Eve Wilkowitz had been manually strangled. And then came the finding that would define every aspect of this case for the next 4 decades. Based on the condition of her body and the forensic timeline, the medical examiner determined that Eve had very likely been held alive for most of those 3 missing days. She was not killed the night she was taken. She was kept captive, bound, and alive. She was murdered only hours before she was found on that Tuesday morning lawn. Think about the weight of that. While her boyfriend was at the police station filing a missing person report, while her father, Alfred, was waiting for a phone call, while the machinery of ordinary Saturday and Sunday life continued in Bay Shore, Eve Wilkowitz was alive, somewhere within walking distance, held by someone, and no one knew. The location where her body was left would become one of the most painful details in the entire history of this case. Center Avenue sits directly between the Long Island Railroad Station and Eve's apartment on Fifth Avenue. It was part of her route home. The house at 26 Center Avenue, where she was found, was 4 houses from the residence where her killer had been staying with his mother that week. 4 houses, 100 yards of sidewalk. The killer and his victim were practically neighbors. Police recovered a rape kit at the scene. The Suffolk County Crime Lab carefully preserved every biological sample collected from Eve's body. In 1980, forensic DNA profiling did not exist. The technology that would eventually identify her killer was still more than a decade from being developed, but the lab stored those samples with full chain of custody, banking on a possibility they could not name yet, that someday science would catch up to what they could not solve. That decision is the reason this story has an ending. Suffolk County Police treated the murder of Eve Wilkowitz as exactly what it was, one of the most disturbing and baffling homicides the department had encountered. Detectives canvassed dozens of streets in expanding circles around Center Avenue, Fifth Avenue, and the railroad station. They knocked on every door they could find. They showed Eve's photograph to railroad riders and station attendants. They retraced her entire route from the Macmillan offices in Midtown Manhattan, to Penn Station, to the Bay Shore platform to her apartment, searching for a single person who had seen anything at any point along the way. They interviewed hundreds of people. Neighbors, co-workers, commuters, strangers who happened to be in the area. They investigated Jack Dempsey, the colleague who drove her to Penn Station. They investigated her boyfriend. Both cooperated fully. Both were cleared. They widened the search further. Local parolees, registered sex offenders in the Bay Shore area, anyone reported acting strangely near the train station. They built exhaustive lists of neighborhood residents and worked through them name by name, door by door. One of those doors was on Center Avenue. A woman named Mrs. Rice answered. She was the mother of a 29-year-old man named Herbert Rice, who had recently been kicked out by his wife and was temporarily staying in her home. Mrs. Rice told the detectives she had not noticed anything unusual on the night in question or in the days that followed. The interview was logged. The detectives marked it routine and moved to the next door. They kept going. Over the following months and years, investigators collected DNA elimination samples from people they had interviewed. They tested suspect after suspect. At one point, years into the cold case, they obtained DNA from the brother of a deceased man connected to a string of killings from the 1980s, checking whether Eve might have been among his victims. The DNA did not match. One detective who worked the case in its early years called it one of the biggest mystery murders we have ever had. The investigation had consumed enormous resources, hundreds of interviews, dozens of tested leads, a community turned inside out. Nothing produced a name. Lieutenant Kevin Bayer, who oversaw the Wilkowitz investigation, kept 3 bankers' boxes in his office at the Suffolk County Police Department. Inside them, yellow police reports, crime scene photographs, interview notes, newspaper clippings, forensic records, the Wilkowitz files. Not in storage, not in an archive, right there at his desk within arm's reach. Every other unsolved homicide eventually went to a shelf somewhere. Eve's case never left his office. It was a reminder, kept deliberately close, that the work was not finished. Irene Wilkowitz was 17 years old when her sister was murdered. Her mother had been dead for 4 years already. And now the person who had stepped into that gap, the older sister who had become her anchor, was gone too, murdered. And whoever did it was walking free somewhere, maybe in the same town, maybe on the same sidewalk she crossed every morning on the way to work. That thought did not soften with time. Irene later told reporters she had spent 42 years in a constant state of fear. She was afraid the man who killed Eve would come for her next. She was afraid she would pass him in a grocery store or a parking lot and never know she had been standing next to her sister's killer. She built a life anyway. She married and became Irene Brosinger. She raised 2 children. She went through a divorce. She eventually moved from Long Island to Rhode Island, putting physical distance between herself and the place where everything had collapsed. When she had a son, she named him Evan, as close to Eve's name as she could get without giving him the exact same one. A quiet inheritance, a way of carrying something of her sister into the next generation. Their father, Alfred Wilkowitz, died in 2010. He went to his grave without ever learning who killed his oldest daughter. With his death, Irene became the last close family member who could speak for Eve. No parents, no other siblings, no one else who had known Eve the way she had. Just one woman in Rhode Island, alone with 4 decades of unanswered questions and a case the world had largely moved on from. She told a reporter in 2016, "I am the only person on the face of the earth who can be her voice." She meant it, and she acted on it. She gave interviews on every anniversary of the murder. She called detectives. She reached out to local television stations in New York. She appeared on camera for PIX 11 in 2016, looking directly into lens, saying her sister's name, saying it mattered, saying that someone somewhere knew what happened on that street in 1980. She kept saying it for 42 years. In May of 2000, 20 years after the murder, the Suffolk County Police Department Homicide Squad resubmitted the preserved biological samples for testing. DNA technology had transformed since 1980. Using a technique called short tandem repeat analysis, lab technicians developed a complete male DNA profile from the biological evidence collected from Eve's body, a profile belonging to a man whose name nobody knew. In July of 2000, that profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, the national criminal database linking DNA profiles from convicted offenders across all 50 states. Nothing came back. The killer's DNA was not in CODIS because he had never been required to submit a sample to any law enforcement database. He existed in the criminal justice system just enough to have a minor record, but not enough to leave a genetic footprint. As far as CODIS was concerned, he did not exist. In 2017, New York State legalized familial DNA searching of its criminal databank. This newer technique searches for partial matches, looking for biological relatives of an unknown suspect who might already be in the system. A brother, a father, a son, someone who shares enough DNA with the killer to establish a family connection. In 2019, Detective Jeffrey Batari was assigned to the Wilkowitz case. He had the lab generate a full Y chromosomal STR profile and submitted it to the New York Division of Criminal Justice Services for familial analysis. No investigative leads were produced, no partial matches, no relatives in the system. Every tool available under New York law had been used. Every tool had come back empty. The evidence existed. The DNA existed. The answer was locked inside biological material that had been carefully preserved for 2 decades. They simply had no key that fit the lock. Not yet. On April 24th, 2018, something happened in Sacramento, California, that permanently changed the landscape of cold case investigation in the United States. The Sacramento County District Attorney's Office announced the arrest of the Golden State Killer, a serial predator responsible for at least 13 murders and more than 50 assaults across California between 1974 and 1986. His name was Joseph James D'Angelo. He was 72 years old, living quietly in a Sacramento suburb, collecting a police pension, completely undetected for more than 4 decades. They caught him using a method called investigative genetic genealogy. Here is how it works, in plain terms. Traditional DNA investigation compares a suspect's DNA against Cody's, which only contains profiles from people who have been arrested or convicted. If the killer was never in the system, Cody's produces nothing. Genetic genealogy takes a completely different approach. Investigators extract a different type of DNA marker, called a single nucleotide polymorphism profile, or SNP. They upload that profile not to a criminal database, but to a public genealogy database. Platforms like GeneMatch, where millions of ordinary Americans have voluntarily uploaded their own DNA to research their ancestry, trace their family trees, find cousins they never knew existed. When D'Angelo's crime scene SNP profile was uploaded to GeneMatch, the database returned hits on distant relatives, third cousins, people who shared enough genetic material with the killer to establish a family connection, even though D'Angelo himself had never used any genealogy service. From those distant matches, investigators built a family tree. They worked backward through generations, cross-referencing names with public records, narrowing the list of candidates, branch by branch, until one man was left standing at the end of every line of descent, Joseph James D'Angelo. The breakthrough meant that a killer no longer needed a criminal record to be identified. He only needed one distant relative, someone he might never have met, to have uploaded their own DNA for personal reasons. That single data point, combined with traditional genealogical research, could reach across decades and pull a name from the dark. For Irene Wilkowitz, sitting in Rhode Island in 2018, the Golden State Killer arrest landed like a signal flare. Her son, Evan, told her about the case. She immediately contacted Cece Moore, the genetic genealogist working with Parabon Nanolabs, the Virginia-based company that had become the leading provider of investigative genetic genealogy services to law enforcement agencies across the country. Moore told Irene she wanted to help. She believed the technology could solve Eve's case. There was one problem, a large one. New York was effectively the only state in the country that would not allow it. Under a decades-old New York State Department of Health regulation, private forensic laboratories needed a specialized forensic identity permit to perform the type of SNP analysis required for genetic genealogy work. No private lab had ever been granted one for this purpose. Parabon Nanolabs had submitted an application. It sat in a bureaucratic queue while weeks turned to months and nothing moved. Irene lobbied anyone who would take her call. State health officials, local representatives, news outlets. Lieutenant Bayer, the detective who had kept these files in his office all those years, told reporters, "The technology is there. Other states have used it. This is a case that is almost screaming for it." State Senator Phil Boyle publicly criticized the Department of Health for blocking a tool that was already solving cold cases in nearly every other state in the country. The DNA evidence existed. It had been preserved since 1980. The technology to decode it existed. It had already produced the most famous cold case arrest in American history. And a bureaucratic permit that no one would sign was the only thing standing between Eve Wilkowitz and the truth. In December of 2019, Suffolk County found a way through the wall. The restriction applied to private laboratories. The FBI operates federal forensic facilities. Federal facilities are not subject to New York State Department of Health permits. Suffolk County formally requested permission to send Eve's biological evidence to the FBI for genetic genealogy analysis. The state approved the request. The FBI agreed to take the case. In 2020, 40 years after the murder, the genetic genealogy process officially began. FBI Special Agent Lori Giordano, a specialist in investigative genetic genealogy, took the lead. Her team worked with the Suffolk County Crime Lab to develop a SNP profile from the biological evidence that had been collected from Eve's body in 1980 and preserved without interruption for 4 decades. The profile was uploaded to a public genealogy database. And then came another period of waiting, the kind of waiting that had defined this case since the beginning. This work is not fast. Database searches take weeks or months. When a distant match appears, building out the family tree is painstaking research. Birth certificates, marriage records, death records, census data, each branch traced forward and backward, Each name cross-referenced with public records, with geography, with timelines. Months passed. Quiet, methodical federal laboratory work with no dramatic announcements, no cable news breaks, just science moving at its own pace. Then, in July of 2021, Agent Giordano called Suffolk County with the first real break in 41 years. A distant relative of the unknown suspect had appeared in the genealogy database. Someone who shared enough DNA with Eve's killer to establish a verifiable biological connection. The match came with a surname, Rice. That single word, pulled from a public database where a distant relative had uploaded their own DNA for personal ancestry research, was the first meaningful lead this case had ever produced. From that surname, investigators built outward. They traced lines of descent, cross-referenced every branch with Suffolk County records, with addresses in Bay Shore, with the timeline of March 1980. Every candidate was evaluated against what was known about the crime, the geography, the proximity to the crime scene, the circumstances of the abduction. The trail narrowed to one man, Herbert Rice. Herbert Rice, who had been 29 years old in March of 1980. Herbert Rice, who had been staying with his mother on Center Avenue in Bay Shore at the time of the murder, after his wife had recently thrown him out of their home. Herbert Rice, who had been dead since 1991. His name had never appeared in the original investigation, not once in 42 years. Not in a single interview, a single tip, a single canvas. He had lived 4 houses from where he left Eve's body. His mother had answered the door when detectives came knocking and told him she had not noticed anything unusual. His name was logged in no file. He was a ghost. Prosecutors would later describe what happened on the night of March 22nd as a crime of opportunity. District Attorney Raymond Tierney told reporters that Rice had a pattern of hanging around the Bay Shore station late at night, drinking in the dark near the platform where commuters came and went. He was there when Eve stepped off the last train. What happened next was not planned. It was predatory, it was opportunistic, and it was fatal. Rice had 3 prior convictions on his record, all for minor nonviolent offenses. Under the laws of the time, none were serious enough to require him to submit a DNA sample to any database. That is why his profile never appeared in Cody's. That is why the DNA that had been waiting in the national database since July of 2000 never found a match. He had just enough of a criminal record to suggest a pattern, and not enough to leave a genetic trail. He died in 1991 at the age of 40. Cancer. He was buried on October 18, 1991, at Oakwood Cemetery in Bay Shore, the same town where he killed Eve, less than a mile from the front lawn on Center Avenue, where he left her body. He took everything he knew into the ground. He left behind 2 sons. Neither of them knew what he had done. In the summer of 2021, with a familial DNA match pointing directly at Herbert Rice, Detective Jeffrey Batari located one of Rice's sons. He initially attempted to collect a DNA sample discreetly, the way cold case investigators sometimes do, waiting for a discarded coffee cup, a cigarette, anything carrying saliva. The approach failed, so Batari drove to the son's home and knocked on the door. He stood on the doorstep and explained who he was and why he was there. He told the son, as carefully as the situation allowed, that his father, Herbert Rice, was a primary suspect in a 1980 murder. The son listened. He said he had not been close to his father. He did not resist. He agreed to provide a cheek swab voluntarily, right there at the door. In late August of 2021, the lab results confirmed it. The son's DNA established that his father, Herbert Rice, was the man who had left biological evidence on Eve Wilkowitz's body 41 years earlier. The match was definitive. The son and his mother filled in the remaining geography for investigators. Rice's wife had kicked him out around the time of the murder. He had moved in with his mother on Center Avenue, within easy walking distance of both the railroad station and the exact lawn where Eve was found. Every piece fit. And then the son said something that no one in the room expected. He told Detective Batari he wished he could apologize to the Wilkowitz family for what his father had done. Not defensiveness, not denial, just a son, learning the worst possible truth about a man he barely knew, and his first instinct being to grieve the family his father had destroyed. On December 6, 2021, Detective Batari and a homicide sergeant made the drive from Suffolk County to Rhode Island. They went to the home of Irene Wilkowitz Brosinger. They knocked on her door, 41 years after her sister's murder, and told her they finally knew who killed Eve. Irene later described the moment by saying it felt like being told all over again that her sister was dead. The relief she had spent 4 decades imagining did not arrive the way she had expected. Instead, there was a different weight. The confirmation, a name attached to the nightmare, and the knowledge that the man who carried that name had been dead for 30 years, beyond any courtroom, any sentence, any confrontation. The answer she had waited her entire adult life for did not bring peace. It brought a different kind of grief. The grief of finally knowing exactly what happened and understanding that there was nothing left to punish and no one left to face. The familial match from Rice's son was compelling, but prosecutors wanted certainty that went beyond compelling. They wanted DNA directly from Herbert Rice himself before making any public announcement. They wanted to close the oldest cold case in Suffolk County history on direct confirmation, not familial inference. That meant opening his grave. Detective Batari formally requested that the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office obtain a search warrant for Herbert Rice's burial plot at Oakwood Cemetery. The application went before New York Supreme Court Justice John B. Collins, who reviewed the full investigative record, the DNA results from Rice's son, and the genealogical research that had produced the name. He authorized the warrant. On March 10, 2022, a team assembled at Oakwood Cemetery in Bay Shore. Cemetery personnel, members of the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's Office, technicians from the County Crime Lab maintaining chain of custody. Detective Batari supervised the operation. They excavated the plot slowly and carefully, with the same forensic discipline that had governed every step of this investigation since 1980. They raised the coffin of Herbert Rice from the ground where it had rested since October of 1991. 31 years of silence beneath the soil of the same town where he had committed a murder no one could solve during his lifetime. The coffin was opened. The Suffolk County Chief Medical Examiner personally examined the remains and removed bone samples for DNA extraction. The material was transported to the crime lab under strict forensic protocols. Then came the final wait, the same kind of waiting this case had always demanded. Except this time, everyone involved already believed they knew the answer. They were confirming what the science had already said. On March 23, 2022, the results came back. The DNA extracted from Herbert Rice's skeletal remains matched the male DNA profile developed from the biological evidence collected from Eve Wilkowitz's body in 1980. The same profile entered into Cody's in July of 2000. The same profile that had returned 0 matches for over 2 decades. The same profile that familial searching alone could not fully confirm. The match was direct. Confirmed. From bone. March 23, 2022. 42 years to the day he boarded the last train from Penn Station and never came home. The oldest cold case in Suffolk County history was solved. Not by confession. Not by a witness finally breaking their silence. Not by a living suspect sitting across a table from a detective. It was solved by reaching into the ground and pulling the truth out of the dead man's bones. 1 week later, on March 30, 2022, Suffolk County District Attorney Raymond Tierney and Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison stood before reporters in Riverhead, New York. Tierney spoke first. He announced that the 42-year homicide case of Eve Wilkowitz had been closed. He called his study in persistence and determination. And then he said the sentence that summarized everything that had happened over 4 decades in a single line. Without DNA, he told the room, this would never have been solved. He was right. Without the biological evidence preserved in 1980, without the DNA profile developed in 2000, without the FBI's genetic genealogy analysis in 2021, without the exhumation in 2022, there was no other road to Herbert Rice. No witness would have come forward. No paper trail existed. No living person carried the answer. The only path to the truth ran through 42 years of carefully maintained evidence and a technology that did not exist when the crime was committed. Commissioner Harrison credited the partnership between the police department, the district attorney's office, and the FBI. He thanked his predecessor, Commissioner Geraldine Hart, for initiating the federal relationship that made the genetic genealogy process possible. and he said something that cut through the formality of everything else in the room. "I pray that nobody else has to go through this type of ordeal." Irene Wilkowitz had driven hours from Rhode Island to be there. She walked into that press conference and for the first time in her life saw a photograph of Herbert Rice, the man who killed her sister. "The last face Eve ever saw," she told reporters afterward. "This is my first time seeing him. I didn't want to see the last face that Eve saw while she was still alive." She paused, and then she said the words she had spent 42 years waiting to say out loud. "I still cannot believe I heard those words. We have identified the person responsible for the death of Eve." And then Irene did something that surprised the room. She expressed sympathy for Herbert Rice's family, for his sons, who were only now learning what their father had done more than 40 years ago. "I feel badly for them," she said. "A family member is responsible for a crime like this, and they have to live knowing that. 42 years of fear. 42 years of grief and unanswered questions." And at the moment the answer finally arrived, Irene Wilkowitz found the capacity to think about someone else's pain alongside her own. Lieutenant Baer, the detective who had kept those 3 bankers' boxes in his office and refused to put them away, credited Irene entirely. "She deserves the credit," he said. "I think she's a star in this case." Because Herbert Rice was dead, there would be no prosecution, no trial, no sentencing. The case was closed posthumously. Justice in the courtroom, sentence could not be delivered, but the truth was no longer buried. The name was known. The evidence was confirmed down to the skeleton. And the uncertainty that had consumed Irene's life since 1980, the not knowing, the fear that the man might still be alive somewhere, was permanently, finally over. The Eve Wilkowitz case leaves 3 lessons that anyone following cold cases or concerned with justice needs to carry with them. The first is about evidence preservation. The Suffolk County Crime Lab made a decision in 1980 that nobody at the time could fully understand the importance of. They preserved biological samples from a crime they could not solve, maintaining chain of custody for 40 years, trusting that someday the science would catch up. That decision, made by people whose names will never be famous, is the single reason Herbert Rice was identified. Every law enforcement agency in the country should operate on that principle. Evidence from unsolved homicides must be preserved indefinitely, not archived loosely, not allowed to degrade through poor storage. If the evidence survives, the case survives. If the evidence is lost, so is every future technology that might have cracked it. The second lesson is for families living in the cold case limbo that Irene Wilkowitz survived for 42 years. If your family's unsolved case involved biological evidence, and that evidence was collected before the year 2000, it may never have been tested against modern genealogy databases. Contact the investigating agency and ask specifically whether a SNP profile has been developed from the evidence and whether it has been submitted to public genealogy databases. Cody's is not enough. Familial searching alone is not enough. Investigative genetic genealogy through platforms like GeneMatch requires a different type of DNA analysis than traditional criminal database searches. Ask the question by name. Push for an answer. Irene Wilkowitz pushed for years. That persistence is part of why her sister's case is now closed. The third lesson is quieter, but it matters. Eve had told people in the weeks before her death that a man had followed her on that late-night walk home from the Bay Shore station. She noticed it. She was frightened. She told the people around her. She did not file a police report, and she kept making the walk because she had no other choice. That is not a failure on her part. That is a failure of circumstance and of systems that make women feel that a fear without a name is not worth reporting. If someone tells you they have been followed, that fear is a police report. Treat it that way. The people around Eve heard her and did not know what to do with what she said. Knowing what to do with that kind of warning might be the most important thing anyone listening to this story takes away from it. Eve Wilkowitz was 20 years old. She loved horses. She loved music and books and drawing. She loved being a big sister. She had a dream job at a publishing house in Manhattan and plans that stretched well beyond the secretary's desk. She was commuting 3 hours a day on the Long Island Railroad because she was building something and she was willing to work for it. On a Friday night in March of 1980, she boarded the last train from Penn Station and stepped off in Bay Shore and started the 10-minute walk she had made hundreds of times before. She never made it. And for 42 years, the man who took her life was buried in a cemetery less than a mile from where he left her body, in the same small town where he killed her, in the same ground where he had lived his life and died his death and assumed the truth had died with him. It took a crime lab that refused to discard evidence, a detective who refused to shelve 3 boxes of files, a sister who refused to stop saying her sister's name, a regulatory workaround, a federal agency, a distant DNA match in a public ancestry database, a son who opened his front door and agreed to a cheek swab, and a court order to excavate a coffin. But they reached him. They pulled the answer out of the ground. And Eve Wilkowitz, the girl who loved horses and wanted to help people and was building a life one Long Island Railroad commute at a time, finally got the one thing her sister had been fighting for since 1980. The truth, if this case stayed with you. If you believe every forgotten victim deserves their story told the right way, subscribe to